We're in your American history book in chapter 16, section 1. This section is on the Civil War, which is a pretty low time in American history. In fact, it's kind of hard studying it, thinking that this would even happen in our country with Americans fighting against Americans. So let's begin. We're going to be talking about the war beginning at Fort Sumter. That's where it began. It actually began before that, but that's when the first shots were fired. And the reaction to the conflict, and the northern advantages and the southern advantages. So this is just in section 1. It's going to be 5 sections. So as you can see here, Fort Sumter here, and the fire, and Abraham Lincoln, his generals there, and the Civil War begins and the politics of it. So let's go on. War begins at Fort Sumter here. April 1861. Only 2 forts had been taken over by the South. They were the only 2 forts that had not been taken over by the South. And Fort Sumter was one of them. The other was Fort Pickens, which was in Pensacola, Florida. And it remained in the Union throughout. But Fort Sumter was in Charleston, South Carolina. And we know that South Carolina will be the first state to secede from the Union. The commander in charge at Fort Sumter was Major Robert Anderson here. Picture of him. He lived 1805 to 1871. They only had like 1 month's of provisions left. And South Carolina then blocked the supplies from arriving. The general was P.G.T. Beauregard right here. He lived 1818 to 1893. And he was commissioned by the South to seize the fort before the supplies even arrived. So on April 12, 1861, the Confederates would shell the fort or bomb the fort for 2 days. Finally, Major Anderson here was forced to surrender. The Civil War had begun. If you investigate both of these generals here, they actually had been friends prior to the war at West Point. Basically, Robert Anderson being a lot older, but they had known each other. So to even go against each other when they were at the same school in America as fellow schoolmates, you know. So anyway, here we have the war beginning at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War, the War of Secession. That's secession. The reason for the war in the beginning was because the states were seceding from the Union. What is secession? It means the states were deciding they did not want to be part of the United States of America and they wanted to be their own independent nation. So on April 15th, President Abraham Lincoln, he called 75,000 volunteer troops for only 3 months service. Why did he do that? He thought this was going to be very short, a short war, and that he would be able to get a hold of the rest of the states, or before the rest of the states succeeded, that he would have this all underhand. He did not think this would be a long war. He believed a quick defense would be the best. And the North was very poorly prepared to even fight for this war. But we find out that the war would go on a long 4 more years with much, much bloodshed, more than any other war in the United States of America, international war or such. This war would do havoc to America. So here a picture of Abraham Lincoln, President Abraham Lincoln. The reaction to conflict. President Lincoln said, "The Constitution was permanent binding contract. Therefore, states could not leave it without the agreement of the other states. He called this unilateral secession, and that this was against the law, so they couldn't just secede from the Union. Southerners rebelling was really part of a military overthrow of the country. So now the news of the siege rallied the North behind President Lincoln, regardless of the political party that they belonged to. People were going to President Lincoln in agreement that states were not allowed to secede from the Union. And if they did, that would be a military overthrow of the country. So it would lead to war. Later on, Lincoln would use an issue that he called the Emancipation Proclamation. This is very important because the Emancipation Proclamation set free the slaves in the southern states that had seceded from the Union. And this was very important. You think, well, why would this be that important? Well, for two big reasons. One reason was that all of the slaves could actually fight for the Northern cause, as they would be free. The other reason was that the foreign countries, such as Great Britain, would not dare join in and help the Confederacy because they had moral issues in their countries. They did not want to fight a war for slavery. As in Great Britain, they already had that issue, and basically they had already claimed emancipation for the slaves there prior. So as soon as it was proclaimed the war had to do with slavery, it changed the whole issue, especially in regard to foreign countries coming in and helping the South. Why do you think the foreign countries would help the South? Well, because one big reason, economics. They really wanted the Southerners' cotton, because cotton became very important, an export to the European countries. And so they thought, wow, we will support the South and we'll be able to have easier access to their cotton, right? But as soon as it had to do with slavery, all of the countries in Europe would back off. So this Emancipation Proclamation would keep the European powers from interfering in the war. And slavery now, after the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery would be the course of the Civil War. It'd be based on slavery, not just on secession from the Union. The South. Most Southerners believed in the Constitution as a compact or treaty between independent nations to act as a group. You see the difference? Now, the Southerners were not believing that the Constitution was federal uniting the nations and that they could not withdraw. They just believed it was a treaty between independent nations, and they believed their state was actually an independent nation. And so, therefore, the states then felt like they had a right to leave the compact because the states' rights were more important than the rights of the whole country. But the North would view this as an insurrection. So that would lead to war. And the causes, the reason the South, why would you think that the South would want to secede? Well, for number one, the North refused the Fugitive Slave Act. So the people in the North were refusing to, when slaves were runaway slaves coming to the North, they were refusing to bring the slaves back and give them back to their slave owners. So a lot of people in the North was refusing to the Fugitive Slave Act at all, number one. And in the North, there had a lot of people that were against slavery. In the South, of course, they had the plantations, which was an economic gain for them. And so we have a very big divide between the North and the South. Then, of course, was the election of a Republican president, the first Republican president. Remember, the first Republican candidate for president actually was Fremont. And John C. Fremont, was an abolitionist. He was against slavery, him and his wife Jessie, but they did not win for he did not win for the president, of course. Buchanan won, and Buchanan was very sentimental, or very lenient towards slavery. I didn't know if he had slaves himself, but he took the position of, representing the South more than the North. So now we have a Republican president, the first Republican president being Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln hated the issue of slavery. He hated it, and the South knew. So they were already preparing in the South, if President Lincoln became president, to succeed or withdraw from the Union, and which would start a war. So they were already taking over some of the federal supplies and such, and the federal forts in the South. They were trying to take them over even before President Abraham took his inaugural address and became president. There was also tariff disputes, and that was a long time going, about cotton, because in the North they would have the higher tariff for exports and such, and that had been an issue, as you know, for a long time, but not an issue that you would want to withdraw from the Union about, right? And also, the South believed the states' rights would be above the rights of the federal law, saying that their rights as states were sovereign. That means they were to take precedent over any federal law. So those were the reasons. These are some of the reasons for the seceding from the Union. Very important, because you wonder, how could this happen? But this is how it went. And because the North and the South had already been so riled up on the issue of slavery, now we would have, over the years, and now we would have this huge divide happen. The states then start to secede. Like I said, they withdraw from the Union of the United States and decide not to be in the United States of America. The first one to do this would be South Carolina. Remember, we talked about Fort Sumter in South Carolina, where the war began. Virginia then seceded immediately after, and in Washington, D.C., the President Lincoln in Washington, D.C. and such became very aware that Virginia, when Virginia seceded, that the war would be very close to Washington, D.C. As you know, Virginia is very close to the capital. And so this would be very important that the president would have an army that would protect the Capitol building, because first thing they want to do, would be attack Washington, D.C. Before May, then, now we have South Carolina and Virginia. Before May, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, right here, would succeed. Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia would succeed at this time. So, however, many people still had strong Union ideals. So in the midst of all this, although you have some of these states, especially in Virginia, seceding, there's people in Virginia that really didn't want to succeed. And so this is what happened. You see, we have Virginia and we have West Virginia. West Virginia was not even a state then. So in 1863, the counties were admitted to the Union as a new state because the people in West Virginia did not want to succeed. It split Virginia and West Virginia into two states. So West Virginia would be a northern state. They would want to stay in the Union, and they would want to be loyal to President Lincoln, and then on to Virginia succeeding here. And you have to say, even in some of these other states, a lot of the people did not want to succeed. So this would divide, brother against brother, and some would fight for the North and some would fight for the South. And so 4 more states wanted to see what the course of conflict would be. So we have here, in the end, you're going to have all these states here in the red here, which will go on from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida. All of these states would decide to follow South Carolina and secede from the Union. The important question was, What conflict, was the conflict going to be centered on slavery, or was it not? And as I said before, we find out it would be in the future. But that goes on to 2 years of fighting before President Lincoln put forth the Emancipation Proclamation, setting the slaves free in these states. And so, and later on, we'll have Congress putting together the 13th Amendment. But we'll get into that a little bit later. So basically the question would be, is this war going to be about slavery, or is it going to be about seceding from the Union? Well, one of the reasons they seceded from the Union was the issue of slavery. Then we had the border states, and the border states were so important for President Lincoln because all of these states here seceded from the Union. There would be some states that would be pretty much divided, and the president knew this. And so these border states would remain loyal to the United States, but the sentiment in those states was sharply divided, especially on the issue of slavery. And some people would join the Union in those states, and others the Confederate states. The Southern Confederacy was of the states of America. They were the states that withdrew from the Union. They were called the Confederacy. These border states, if you need to know these border states, were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, right here, this yellow area. And so President Lincoln was, very much kind of catering to them, thinking we want to keep them in the North in the Union. If not, they would give big problems in the midst of this. And so when he did the Emancipation Proclamation, you'll find that he focused it mainly on the southern states and saying all the slaves would be free, and those states that had withdrawn from the Union and became the Confederacy. So people kind of criticize him because he didn't say anything about these border states. Well, a lot of it, of course, the North, and especially in California and the territories, the slaves had already been set free. The only issue would be in these border states here. Later on, we'll find the Emancipation Proclamation with the 13th Amendment would be the slavery would be, all the slaves would be set free in the entire nation. So let's go on. The northern advantages. So as the war started, we know that in the North there were some great advantages compared to the South. The North had abundant resources compared to the South. In the North, there were 25 states in the North, and there were only 11 states in the South. So that was almost, less than half. In the North, there were 22 million people to 9 million people in the South, which is, as you look at this 9 million, you have to realize that up to 3.5 to 4 million of that 9 million were slaves, and slaves were not allowed to fight. So if you subtract, really, there were only 5 million people that would actually compare to 22 million people in the North. So the North had more capital, it had more factories, it had more skilled laborers, it had more ammunition, it had all these things compared. In fact, in New York State's industry alone doubled the entire southern industry. So the South didn't have much industry at all. And even in New York State, like I said, it had more industry than two times that of the South. And the North also had better transportation, because in the North we had many railroads, in the South very few. Plus in the North they had better communication, telegraph, and newspapers in the North. In the South they had not those things, or at least had not used the telegraph and communication or newspapers. The North had a large merchant marine, their ships, and also which in a naval force of the Navy. So here we have, those are big advantages the North had. So up here again, let's see, 85% of the nation's industry, New York alone outnumbered the entire South. The Southern slave system slowed the industrial development. Slavery in the South was a disadvantage to them economically. Southern advantages. Well, in the South, they had some advantages of the war. First of all, they had a head start in preparing for the war. When they were thinking ahead, thinking, oh, if Abraham Lincoln becomes president, we need to be prepared for war. They had already decided that they would succeed from the Union, and so they had already seized military forts and federal property that were in the South. They organized their military before the North even took any action of having a military organized at all, or even thinking of war. And many of those in the South sold their farms to fight or left their slaves to farm for them. So they already were prepared for war. The North was not prepared for war. Several European countries were sympathetic to the South because what I told you before, the countries, especially of Great Britain and France, they were dependent on cotton. Now, for cotton clothing and cotton, it became so important to them. And of course, in Europe, they didn't grow cotton. Of course, in America, the cotton plantations were plentiful, especially in the South. So they were sympathetic at their economic value, weren't they? And the early states brought the South ready for war. So basically, the states were ready for war. But later, the North would show to have superior resources. Another thing I thought very important here was the Southern advantages, their leadership. Most of the country's expert military colleges were in the South, and most officers sided with the South. So the South had a military tradition. So we'll find some great military leaders. It's really, to look at the leadership of the South, and the way the South did so greatly, despite all the Northern advantages, because of their leadership and their military leadership. We'll find that General Lee was a military genius, as well as Stonewall Jackson, So that was a great advantage. The military tactics, the South had to only repel the North's attacks. So basically, the South, mainly, they knew the terrain. As the North came into the South to invade the South knew, and they were protecting their own land at that point. Now, that's not totally, because you'll see the South comes into attacking the North in the midst of Virginia, coming into that area in the East. And we'll talk about that later when we discuss the battles. In the morale, the Southerners were fighting for their way of life, and they were fighting to protect their homes from the Northern aggression. It's very sad that that would have to be that way, because if there was any other way to help the South and in the freeing of the slaves, if it could have been in any other way besides war, it would be so much better, but anyway. Southern advantages. Military leaders. Many of the military leaders had gathered their experience because they had been in the Mexican-American War, in the midst of that, and the Territorial War, where America actually came into possession of a lot of Mexican territory. And we went over that in the last chapter or so. But a lot of these generals had already fought, and they had already been experienced, most of them, both in the North and the South. And many had come from West Point in military training. In fact, some of them had, been college, friends, college mates, basically roommates and such, they knew each other. So in the North, we have some of the famous military leaders, and of course we're going to go over these military leaders, but some that you need to know, of course, is Ulysses S. Grant, become one of the most famous military leader in the North, along with General Sherman. And you'll find General Sherman, actually, when you think about what he does. Anyway, we'll get into that in Sherman's marches and destruction of the southern areas and the southern towns. Of course, we also have Sheridan, Meade, Butler, McClellan. The thing is about the North, President Lincoln went through generals quickly. He was very disappointed in a lot of the generals that he had, and so he replaced them over and over. Some of these were diehard Christians. I have to say McClellan and Rosecrans were two of the Christian leaders in the North, and I think McClellan was a Roman Catholic. But they made sure that their soldiers did hear the gospel. The South was very much promoting the gospel and what they did. We have the famous Robert E. Lee, being a Christian. Stonewall Jackson here was a diehard Christian, and he made sure that all of his soldiers would know the Lord. He was. But these were military heroes, and here's some, of course. These two were generals in the South: Johnston, Pickett, Hood, and Forrest. But you need to know mostly about Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson there. So I think I'm going to stop there, and then we'll get into the battles of the war. So let's go ahead and stop.